What's up, everybody, and welcome in to another edition of the Sit Down. As always, if you enjoy this video, please make sure you hit the like button and let me know what you think of the discussion in the comment section below. Also, if you're new around here, you just haven't done it yet, you're living under a rock and seeing this video for the first time, I don't know what you're waiting for. Hit that subscribe button below now so you never miss another Sit Down video. If you want more great, organized crime and true crime content, please also check out my podcast, The Sit Down, a crime history podcast presented by Barstool Sports. You can find the link to that podcast in the description below this video. Make sure you check it out. You won't be sorry. Today, ladies and gentlemen, let's get in to another organized crime topic. And when TV history is written, there'll be very few shows that rival The Sopranos. The show would debut in 1999, and it would tell the story of New Jersey mob boss Tony Soprano. We would meet his family at home, and we'd also meet his criminal family. We developed many incredible characters that live on still today. Interestingly enough, though, some of the characters were actually connected to the Mafia. Today, we're going to tell their stories, what they were a part of, what they did, and what they do now. The story next on Sit Down Shorts. The first individual we're going to get into today is Larry Boy Baris, played by Anthony Borghese, a.k.a. Tony Darrow. Now, Darrow would be born in 1938 in the Brooklyn neighborhood of East New York. As we know, with East New York, it was a haven for years for the real mafia. Most notably, John Gotti, Paul Vario, all sorts of families were in East New York and would ultimately move to Queens down the road. Now, during his youth and into his adult life, Tony Darrow would actually gain several odd jobs in the neighborhood due to the influence of Lucchese heavyweight Paul Vario. And he'd actually maintain a relationship with Vario for many years. Now, Tony Darrow would eventually get into acting, but it was very well known that he would also know a young John Gotti, who, as we know, John Gotti would spend his formidable years in East New York before moving over to Ozone Park, Queens, with the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club. We also know that Gotti's mentor or early mentor, Carmine Fatico, is from East New York as well. Now, Tony Darrow would obviously act in The Sopranos. He would also act in other films like Analyze This, Kill the Irishman, and the most notable, Goodfellas. He would play a character called Sally Buns. Now, interestingly enough, in that film, Tony Darrow would act alongside Paul Sorvino, who would play Paul Vario, his friend in real life. Definitely kind of an interesting connection. Now, for Tony Darrow, he would not completely leave his connections to the Mafia after his time on The Sopranos. In 2009, Mr. Darrow would be busted for a 2004 assault case that he would be connected to. Allegedly, the federal government would find out that an individual in Monticello, New York, owed Mr. Darrow a $5,000 payment. The debtor obviously was not paying. Mr. Darrow allegedly went to two Gambino-connected gangsters, John Monteleone and Joseph Joey Boy Orlando. Now, Darrow would instruct or allegedly instruct these two individuals to go collect the money. Now, the debtor would be assaulted. And ultimately, for Joey Orlando, he would get 51 months in prison for this little stunt. Tony Darrow would ultimately escape any jail time, and he was spared. By this point, he was a pretty old man, and he would use his connections to charities and his work on TV as a way to get out of this little thing. Now, sadly for Darrow and Orlando, John Monteleone would become a cooperator. For Tony Darrow, his real-life connections to the Mafia almost sent him to prison. The next individual we're going to talk about is Furio Junta. In the show, Junta would be an enforcer for the Soprano crew, and at one point would be the driver for Tony Soprano. In the show, Furio would strike up a friendship with Tony Soprano's wife, Carmela. Now, it never truly became romantic, but the feelings were mutual. Eventually, the Naples-born Furio would disappear, and we would never quite know what actually happened to Furio Junta. Now, for the actor in real life, Federico Castelluccio, he would be involved in a bizarre situation in the 2000s. Upon his success in the popular television show, Mr. Castelluccio was flush with cash. He would get involved with an individual called Gino Pesci, a cousin of actor Joe Pesci. Gino Pesci was a budding restaurateur and got Castelluccio to invest about $50,000 in an eatery in North Jersey. The eatery would get into business and eventually go belly up. Now, for Castelluccio, he was a little bit annoyed because he wanted his money back. By this point, Castelluccio would come into contact with Colombo heavyweight Andrew Mush Russo. According to the lawyer for Castelluccio, Mush Russo, who would eventually become the boss of the Colombo crime family, met Castelluccio while Mush Russo was doing prison time. He would meet him in a visiting room as Castelluccio was there seeing a friend, and they would strike up a friendship. Now, upon the belly up of the restaurant, Castelluccio, according to sources, allegedly may have mentioned this to Mush Russo. Now, Russo would then get into a conversation at one point with Colombo mobster Anthony Russo, no relation. Mush Russo would tell Anthony Russo, quote, and I am quoting, "See if you can locate this Gino Pesci to get the money back for my friend. We need to get Furio from the Sopranos money." This was discussed in a conversation that was secretly being recorded by a turncoat in the Colombo crime family. At one point, Castelluccio would also attend a bail hearing to, quote, show support for a friend. Now, ultimately, nothing would happen to Federico Castelluccio. He was never brought to any sort of case in this thing and really just had to eat the fact that his money was gone. Now, both people involved, Pesci and Castelluccio, through the lawyers, would say that this was nothing more than just two friends that, one loaned someone money and it didn't work out. For Mush Russo, as we know, he would be mirrored by the law for most of his life until the end. He would be arrested in 2021 in a big case involving the Colombo crime family, as well as the Bonanos. Mush Russo would actually die in 2022. Did Furio have connections to the Mafia? Kind of. It was more of just friendships, but it was important that we mention it. A very interesting story. Now, weirdly enough, Anthony Russo down the road would ultimately cooperate and become an informant for the government. He could be seen here in a court drawing. He would turn up in a weird documentary done by Trevor McDonald, a British TV reporter, where Russo would discuss his time as a canary nowadays. The next individual we're going to get into is the most notable. Paulie Walnuts would be a fan favorite. And if you've ever seen the show, we can't forget Tony Circo's terrific work as the hairpiece, clean freak nut, who we never quite knew how he made money in the show. Tony Circo, the real life version of Paulie Walnuts, would be born in 1942 and would live in Brooklyn, New York, most of his time in Bensonhurst. It was said by age 30, Tony Circo had been arrested 28 times. In fact, by the age of 7, he would be detained by New York City Police Department officers for stealing change from a push cart. Tony Circo would be involved with the law a lot by his formidable years. He would become connected with the Colombo crime family at some point in, we can guess, the 60s. As we know, in Brooklyn, the Colombo crime family is very dominant. At some point, he would make a connection with Gerard Jerry Green Eyes Clemenza, a higher up in the Colombo crime family. They would maintain friendship their entire lives. Now, for Paulie Walnuts, he would have all sorts of charges that would be waged against him. At one point, he would be a drug dealer. He was an extortion artist. He was a debt collector. And he was also a formidable associate. It was said that he was a pretty good burglar and thief and made some pretty solid money for the Colombo crime family. At one point, he would be arrested, though, and be charged with extortion and weapons possession. Circo would head off to Sing Sing prison for a 20-month sentence. Now, for Tony Circo, he would see the light of day. He would completely renaissance his life and take up acting. Now, for Tony Circo, we can all be lucky. We love some of his performances in The Sopranos, but he was also in some really great movies, including the HBO version of Gotti, where he would play a gangster connected to John Gotti. He would also be seen in Goodfellas and Casino, as well as others. Now, for Tony Circo, he would move on in his life. He would become a big-time actor on a big-time television show. In fact, he was actually one, if not the second most important character in the show outside of Tony Soprano, and he's probably the most recognizable outside of Tony Soprano. Now, in 1999, when the show debuted, it was still pretty obvious that Tony Circo was still connected to certain members of the Mafia. Obviously, he was not a mobster, but he still maintained connection. In fact, during a surveillance on Christmas 1999, Tony Circo would be seen alongside Vincent Pastore, who would play Big Pussy on The Sopranos. They would be seen at a Christmas party for the Colombo family where Jerry Green Eyes Clemenza would be present, among others. Now, nothing would ultimately happen, but it did maintain and show that Tony Circo still maintained friendships. I don't think any of these individuals truly would ever forget their friends. Tony Circo was old school, and we have to remember that. Sadly, Tony Circo would pass away in July 2022 at the age of 79. May he rest in peace. He is one of the great gangster film actors we've ever seen. We thank him for moving on from a life of crime. I don't know where the show would have been without him. Really, the most interesting of all these people is this individual, Michael Squicciarini. Now, if you've ever seen The Sopranos, most fans of the show know a lot about it. And if you blink, you may have missed Squicciarini in the show. He would play an individual called Frank Chipolina. In fact, we would only see Frank Chipolina for one scene. And this scene would occur in season 2 at a homecoming for jailed associate Richie Aprile. In the scene, Chipolina would walk up and hand Richie an envelope as a gesture of good faith. In that same scene, Tony Circo, who he just mentioned, would make a comment to Chipolina, quote, "It's probably all ones," and Chipolina fires back with a glare, if you will. Vincent Pastore tells him to get lost. That's the last time we would see Chipolina. Now, in real life, Chipolina may have been the most formidable gangster of all of them. He could be seen here after his life of crime, but during his early years, he was actually a debt collector for the DeCavalcanti crime family, aka what many call the real Sopranos. Several characters are based on DeCavalcanti members. Squicciarini was a big-time individual. In fact, he stood 6'5", 315 pounds. He was a formidable debt collector for the family, would actually do 60 months in prison for an assault that he would commit during a debt collection. Now, if you're Squicciarini, he would sadly die in 2001 of natural causes. In 2002, the FBI would wage a cold case posthumous file against Squicciarini. They would claim that in 1992, he would lure an individual called Ralph Hernandez, a Brooklyn drug dealer, to a nightclub owned by DeCavalcanti heavyweight Joe Pitts Canigliaro. Upon coming to the club, Mr. Hernandez will be shot 6 times in the head, allegedly by Canigliaro. Now, Squicciarini would also participate in getting rid of the body as well. Now, for Switcherini, he had already died, but it was possible that he was likely involved in setting up a murder and then disposing of the body. Switcherini was a real life gangster, and he was a formidable debt collector. We have to wonder, was he truly involved in that murder? Now, several other members of the show were connected at some point, we believe, to the mafia. One person I did want to mention is Richard Maldone. He would play an individual called Albert Baris in The Sopranos. At one point, he would be called the biggest fucking parakeet in the entire family, I believe. Maldone would be involved in a 2003 case that the federal government would bring on him and members of the Gambino crime family. Now, it is not being said that Maldone was a member of the Gambino crime family, but he would participate allegedly in a designer drug ring that was selling ketamine, LSD, and other designer drugs around the New York area. Mr. Maldone would be arrested in Long Island, and he would be charged with 74 counts of sale of narcotics. Now, down the road, months later, they would actually throw out the case against Mr. Maldone, and Mr. Maldone's lawyer would say, quote, "They just needed my client for some publicity," said lawyer Melvin Roth. Now, as I said, Maldone was never actually, brought to justice or did anything wrong in this case. But I do think it's important to mention that he probably had some sort of run-ins at some point with the Gambino crime family. I also want to bring up Dan Grimaldi, who would play Patsy Parisi in the show. He'd ultimately be a pretty important character by the end of the show. It was said that Patsy Parisi grew up in South Brooklyn, and he would talk about in his early life that a lot of the characters in the show actually reminded him of his father, who was from Brooklyn. Now, Patsy Parisi would turn up in an interesting case involving Bonanno heavyweight Anthony Spiro. He would be seen at the trial of Spiro in the early 2000s. It was talked about that Grimaldi's sister was actually dating Mr. Spiro. Grimaldi would tell a journalist, quote, "I'm hoping the truth comes out on Anthony and that he's found not guilty of these terrible allegations." As we know, that wouldn't happen. Anthony Spiro would be convicted and would die in prison in the 2000s. Dan Grimaldi was not connected to the mafia, but he definitely knew mobsters, and we can say he was somewhat connected. We have to wonder, what else did he know? Who else did he know? That was the only connection that I found. But it was important that I do this. I think it's kind of interesting. Some of this stuff is truly life imitating art. And I'm going to introduce you up here to an interview I did with former FBI agent Jack Garcia. In that interview, he actually told me a very interesting story about the Sopranos, connecting it to the early 2000s leadership in the Gambino crime family as he was undercover dealing with Gambino heavyweight Greg DePalma. I urge you to check out that interview. It's pretty interesting as well. As always, guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. And if you enjoyed it, make sure you hit the like button. We'll see you next week.